All right. Hello, everyone. Hello. Can you hear me all right? Okay, good. Oh, nice. Well, I was the programs manager at the American Library in Paris, and we had trouble when it was too rainy. People didn't want to go out, and we had trouble when it was too nice because people didn't want to come in. Yes. Well, I'm from Shelby, and it's been super windy and cold up there, so I know my dad would be happy with 70 degrees and sunny. Oh, it's my pleasure. I have part. Well, I think it depends on the situation. Everybody has a different situation, and my nieces grew up loving the Billings Library, so I'm really happy to contribute. My sister, yes, yes. Oh, nice. How wonderful. Oh, wow, wow, wow. Well, it looks like he did a beautiful job.
Can, can you hear us talk?
Did we move all, every book, every book was distributed from this?
From this one too?
Yeah, I think so.
I live near the train station, the Gare de Lyon, in the 12th district of Paris. I have a map, and I'll show you exactly where I live on the map. I'm glad I can answer that question. It was in the 8th, and it moved. Actually, that building was destroyed. because it was a mansion and now it's a modern glass building where Dannon has its headquarters. And now it's in the 7th district. It sits in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower now.
To 2003. She lived
Oh, wow.
near the, so she went about the same time you did.
Yes.
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 And she said
Pardon?
she said she's been to the American Library there, so yeah.
Yes.
Okay, why don't you start? And
Okay.
then we're ready for questions. I'll try and moderate. So.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, thank you for choosing the Paris Library as your one book to read, and I hope you enjoyed reading it. My name is Janet Skeslien Charles, and I don't know if you know, I'm from Shelby, Montana. That's where I grew up and went to school. Then I went to university in Missoula, and I love Montana, and it inspires me a lot, and I hope that you found the depiction to be accurate as you were reading the book. I have a hard time reading books set in Montana because I never think it's my Montana, and I'm very critical of writers who write about Montana, even if they're from Montana. It's easier for me to read about books in other places. I thought I would start out with a short presentation, and then if you have questions, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. So here's that map I was talking about earlier. As one of you noted, the book starts in the 8th district of Paris, near this train station, the Gare Saint-Lazare. So Odile lives across the street from this train station. On the way to work, she passes the ebony dome of St. Augustine Church, and then she turns up this narrow side street to go to work. In the book, she mentions that she has trysts with her boyfriend Paul, and they would be in this neighborhood near this park. This is where if you can see my white arrow, this is where the American Library is now, right near the Eiffel Tower. And if we go upriver towards the Notre Dame Cathedral here on the island, I point out in green the place where the Polish Library is. As you read in the book, the Nazis marched into the Polish Library 3 days into the occupation to pillage their books and their collection and send them back to Germany. Luckily, the library recovered many of its objects, and it still exists today, sitting in the shadow of Notre Dame. And then here in black, this is my neighborhood. So here's this train station that I was talking about. That's where my husband works. He drives fast trains, and he goes to Nice or to Montpellier or Perpignan. That's his route. And we live right here in this neighborhood. This used to be a place where they kept barrels of wine. Now it is, they've taken those buildings and they've remodeled them and made them into kind of an outdoor mall. Here, the arrow points to a church. The Nazis were aiming for these train tracks right here, but ended up getting this church, which has since been rebuilt. So I just wanted to, this is a map of the 1930s in Paris, and I just wanted to situate you. Now all of this green is a lot of high rises, so that has certainly changed, even if much of Paris inside the roundabout around the loop has stayed the same. Here we have the library in 1939. Staff comes from the US, Canada, Russia, France, Switzerland, and England. Our story starts here, and I want you to remember this image because we're going to see it a little bit later. Sometimes people ask me why I chose to name the book The Paris Library instead of the American Library in Paris. And one of the reasons is because staff did come from so many countries, so it wasn't just American, and staff continues to come from so many different countries. So it's really an international place. And when I was researching the library for the book, I started with the correspondence in 1920 and 1918, 1919, 1920, and it was referred to as the Paris Library in the correspondence, and I just like the sound of it. Here we have the information card of the American Library in Paris at the time, and as you noted, it was in the 8th district, which you can see right here. The telephone number was only 4 digits. I don't know how many of you remember, but when I was growing up in Shelby, we only had 4 digits as well. So something we have in common. This is really what I was writing to. If you remember the end of the book, the last lines of the book were the American Library in Paris, open daily. So when I saw this card, I really had the ending of my book. Here we have the photo from that image. This image is something I found on the internet, and I became an obsessive Googler when I was researching this book. And it really paid off because everyday archivists and librarians are adding more and more documentation to online collections. I bought this photo from a newspaper archive, so I was really lucky to find it. You can see that I was faithful. I talk about the white bubbled path, the pansies, or maybe petunias. So you can see I was faithful to the library. And this photo was really the inspiration for my character, Margaret. I love the wide brim of her hat and wonder what secrets she's hiding. August of 1939, war is on the way. U.S. Ambassador advised, in view of the situation prevailing in Europe, it is advisable that American citizens return to the United States. He issued this warning in the summer of 1939. This is William Bullock, the ambassador, who issued that warning in 1939 and again in the spring of 1940. Now, I don't know about you, but when an ambassador tells me to leave a country, I'm going to get the heck out. I'm not going to wait around. So I find it really inspiring that all of the librarians decided to stay. They were told to leave twice, and they stayed in France. I find that very, very courageous. Here in this photo, we see the directress, Miss Reader, and Mrs. Turnbull, the cataloger, prepare for war by putting important documents and books in the safe. Here we are in September 1939, 3 days after war was declared. Miss Reader created the soldier service to send books and magazines to English and French soldiers. She declared, no other thing possesses that mystical faculty to make people see with other people's eyes. The library is a bridge of books between cultures. I love that image of a library as a bridge of books. I think it's really beautiful. Now, the library had really good records, so I know that the record for wrapping a care package was 1 minute and 40 seconds. I was surprised that there were no trolleys. At the time, you can see that there were these baskets. That's how they carried the books around. That was something that really surprised me when researching. So there were 100,000 books and magazines sent to soldiers, and there were volunteers from the Quakers, from the YMCA, and from the Red Cross who helped the librarians get those books to soldiers. Here we are with the occupation. And here we have Dorothy Reader in the library in 1936. I bought this photo on eBay for $25, and it was worth every penny. I kept this photo on my desk as I was writing the book. I wrote one book before this, Moonlight in Odessa, about the booming business of email order brides in Ukraine, which was published in 2009 in about 15 languages. So it had done pretty well. So I was surprised when my editor and my agent had no interest in this book. So they passed on this book, and so I had a choice of putting it in the drawer or finding a new team. And so that's what I did. I started writing to other agents, and it took 75 tries before I got an agent. So even though this book was sold in 36 countries, most of those sales went to auction. It did take a long time to get that original interest. And every time I felt a little demoralized, I would look at Dorothy Reader's photo and I would think, if she can face the Nazis, I can send out a few more query letters. I am glad, though, that librarians don't have to get up on chairs to do promotional shots anymore. although I do love this photo. So back with the World War II timeline, on June 12th of 1940, before the Nazis invaded Paris, Miss Reeder sent her staff away for their own safety, but she remained at her post. As you read in the book, she dealt with Dr. Hermann Fuchs, the Nazi library protector. She and Dr. Fuchs were actually on friendly terms because they'd met at international library conferences before the war. So I think it must have been very strange for them, these two book lovers, to find themselves on opposite sides of the war. He said that Jewish people could not enter the library, so Dorothy Reeder and her colleagues got around that edict by delivering books to their Jewish members. Dorothy Reeder was really an amazing woman. She stayed, as you know, in France until May of 1941, when the trustees ordered her back to the States. She didn't stay in the United States for very long. She took a mission with the Library of Congress to go to Bogota, Colombia, where she trained librarians for 2 years. She returned to the United States, did not stay long. She went to England with the American Red Cross, where she set up meeting places for American soldiers in England. She then returned to France with the Red Cross and arrived 3 days after the liberation of Paris. So she worked for the Red Cross there, and she worked for the American Army there for a few years before she returned to the Library of Congress, where she started her career. So she really bookended her career at the Library of Congress. She worked on 3 continents in the 1940s, which I think is absolutely incredible. This is a picture of her desk, and this is about the cleanest her desk has ever looked. Usually it's an avalanche of papers. And she was from Washington, D.C., and that photo behind her is an aerial view of Washington, D.C. Here we have a photo of the Countess from Ohio, Claire de Chambrun. She was one of the original library trustees in 1920, along with the writer Edith Wharton and the millionaire Anne Morgan. During World War II, she was the only trustee to remain in Paris. The others returned to the safety of the States. I think one of the reasons that Claire de Chambrun stayed in Paris is because her daughter was buried in the Picpus Cemetery in Paris. Her daughter died when she was only 18 of heart disease. Claire de Chambrun was also summoned to the office of the Nazi library protector just off the Champs-Élysées at the Majestic Hotel. The ALP had been denounced because its collection contained anti-German journals and political cartoons. This is a photo of Claire de Chambrun at her home near the Luxembourg Garden. I bought this photo off the internet as well. It still stuns me that our history is out there for sale on the internet. She obtained a PhD from the Sorbonne at the age of 48, before there were really non-traditional students, and I think at the time most of the students were men. She was a Shakespeare scholar as well as a novelist, and she also translated Shakespeare's work into French. You can read about her war experiences in her memoir, Shadows Lengthen. She shared a publisher with Hemingway, Scribner. Here we are with that original photo that I told you to keep an eye out for. You can see that Boris is standing in front of the mansion that was the library in 1939. Boris started off at the library as a page, and he worked his way up to head librarian. He was originally from Russia, and he spoke several languages. During the occupation, the Gestapo shot Boris and took him prisoner. He survived and worked at the library until he retired. He's holding his daughter Hélène in his arms. I was thrilled to interview her and her brother Oleg for this book. One thing that she told me was that even though Boris was shot through the lung, he never stopped smoking his beloved Gitan cigarettes. She called him puncture-proof or relentless, and I really enjoyed writing about him. I gave the manuscript when I finished it to Oleg, Boris's son, and he said even though it was 400 pages and in English, Oleg read it in 4 days, and he said that he felt like I'd captured the spirit of his father, so that made me very happy. Here we have a photo of the staff. This is Dorothy Reeder, and I think she looks different in every photo. Boris always looks the same to me. And it's interesting because at the library, Miss Reeder is always Miss Reeder or the directress. the Countess is always Claire de Chambrun or the Countess, but Boris is always Boris. And I don't know why we're on a first name basis with Boris, but not with the other librarians. And I asked his kids about this, and they said that he, despite his noble background, he did his best to put everyone at ease, and that he could talk on any conversation at all about whether it was what shirt to buy, what book to read, how to choose a good horse. He could discuss everything. Here we have mother-daughter librarian team, Evangeline Turnbull in the front row and her daughter, Olivia Turnbull. Evangeline married Captain Ollie Turnbull in Manitoba in 1915. Not long after that, he shipped off to war. He ended up dying in France on the battlefield. Not long after that, his daughter Olivia was born. I find it incredible that the family, these three Turnbulls, all ended up going from Canada to France in world wars. It really is a family of service. Here we have the library love story. This is Helen Thickweiler and Peter Ustinov, who are mentioned in the book. When I was first researching this book and I read that Peter Ustinov worked at the library, I was so excited because I thought it might have been the actor, but no, it was a librarian. It was a librarian, not the actor. I interviewed their daughter for this book as well, and it was very interesting to hear her opinions. This is the library mystery. This is a Jewish librarian named Jeanette Ettlinger, and she worked at the library for 5 years, and she disappeared in 1939. I couldn't find her for a very long time. She was from Chicago, and I looked for her in the American Library Association archives. I looked for her in the American Library archives, and I thought maybe something had happened to her. I thought maybe the Nazis had gotten a hold of her. And in fact, she didn't disappear. She got married. So she went from being Jeanette Ettlinger to Mrs. Herbert E. King. And I think that her husband married her to protect her, to give her the protection of his name. He was a journalist in Vichy, France, and she and he were arrested together, and they ended up being what the Germans called guests of the German government, interned in Baden-Baden, Germany for 15 months with 145 other people. These were embassy workers or Red Cross workers. So they ended up in the same imprisonment in a grand hotel in Baden-Baden, where they couldn't really go outside and they couldn't talk to the Germans. They were really amongst themselves. The first thing that Jeanette did when she got there was to start a library that ended up being 1,200 volumes. And when the 145 people were released and were able to return to the States, they all said the same thing, that Jeanette's library was the one thing that got them through. Here we have the library book tape from The Darkness of War, The Light of Books. And I love how the book is opened like the horizon. There we go. Well, I hope you enjoyed seeing some of the faces to go with the characters in the book.
Great.
I have a few more photos that I didn't put on there. They're on my website. One is of Dr. Fuchs, the Nazi. I wrote to the Stadtbibliothek in Germany, the state library in Berlin, to ask if they had his personnel photo, and so they sent me a photo. And if you look at him, he just doesn't look like we imagine Nazis would look. He looks like a retired Sunday school teacher. In the photos, well, in the book, I have Odile going with the Countess to talk to Dr. Fuchs. And in fact, it was the secretary, it was the library secretary, Hilda Frickert, who is a Swiss-French woman. And so I have her photo as well. The bookkeeper that I mentioned, she was imprisoned and was released at the end of the war and returned to the library. So there are some other photos of the staff if you're interested on my website.
Are you ready for questions?
Yes, any questions?
For me?
I'd love to start. Thank you. Particularly after seeing those photos, it makes me wonder why this is fiction instead of creative nonfiction. And I'm wondering if your publisher talk to you about that in terms of how books sell, and or your thoughts on that?
Well, when I first started writing this book, I thought Dorothy Reader would be my main character. And I had a really hard time putting words in her mouth. And so for several years, this book took about 10 years to write and get published. And for several years, her character was very wooden and very boring because I was so afraid of making a mistake that I didn't take any risks. And her character, she's a very interesting, amazing woman. Everyone says she's dynamic and incredible, wonderful sense of humor, wonderful leader. But my version of her was very dull and watered down. So I realized that if I couldn't put words in her mouth, I needed to create a character. And so I created Odile, who could be a witness to the situation. And at a certain point, I had to make peace with the fact that I would never know exactly what Dorothy Reader said. I have, a couple 100 pages of correspondence and interviews with her. So this is my version of Dorothy Reader. And then I think after I came to peace with that, then I was able to maybe write her character a little better. The book was acquired. The book went to auction, and 11 editors bid on the book. And I interviewed every one of them, and one of them said, the name Miss Reader for a librarian, it's just too on the nose. You're going to have to change that. And I mean, it is the perfect name for a librarian, but I couldn't change it because that really was her name. So there was never really any talk of changing it to a nonfiction book. I know that there is a woman who's working on a nonfiction book about the American Library, about the whole history of the library. So 100 years, not just the war period.
Somebody else?
I have a question, Jen. I'm curious why you chose Floyd for the Montana town. Because I know you were born in Conrad, lived in Shelby's, and Floyd is, most people in Montana don't even know about Floyd. So
That's true. That's true. Well, as you say, I grew up in Shelby, and my neighbors were from the Freud area. And I love the name Freud because, of course, it sounds like Sigmund Freud with all the psychology. And then it's also a French word meaning cold, froid. And I really wanted Odile to end up in, I could have put her in Coeur d'Alene, the heart of Alene. I could have put her there too, but I wanted her to be in a town with a French name. And I wanted her to really be isolated. I did a lot of the book was originally called The War Bride because I grew up 3 blocks away from a war bride from Rouen, France. And I just thought she was so brave to leave behind everything. A lot of these war brides left Europe not knowing whether they would ever be able to return or see their families again. And I think they're so incredibly brave. And so what I found out was war brides and email order brides have a lot in common. And it's not necessarily so much about the husband. It's just like real estate, location, location, location. A lot of these gals, if they end up in a big city where they can have a profession and maybe friends from their own background, they do okay. But when they're in smaller towns, they really struggle. They really, really struggle. And as much as I appreciate Odile, she needed to struggle. And so having that small town, doing the research, I learned that a lot of soldiers coming back from Europe, when they came back with wives, the communities were not super happy because the wives were viewed as stealing a high school sweetheart. And so there was a lot of tension. Sometimes French women didn't have the best reputations. Sometimes there were occasionally German war brides. So they were viewed as the enemy coming into the community. The Montana Historical Society went out and actually interviewed war brides from World War II and Korea. And so you can go to Helena and order these transcripts. And so that's what I did. I just downloaded the transcripts of the interviews on my Kindle
There was I think there was a French war bride who ended up in Billings, for example. So it was very interesting to hear their tales. Another example I remember reading about, not in Montana, but the war bride was never on a first name basis with her mother-in-law. It was always Mrs. Simon. And I just think that's really sad that there's no connection. And so that's why I picked Freud. I wanted her to be in a small town. I wanted there to be a French connection. And I really like the name. Also, I read that there was an opera house in Freud, which I thought was so interesting. I've got to get out there.
Have you ever been there?
I've never been there. The closest I've been was Charlotte and Plentywood. I also love Wolf Point as a name, and I liked imagining Odile getting off the train at Wolf Point, and what she would think of that. We have some great names in Montana.
We do have that. Roger?
We wondered in our group when we discussed this, who is one who knows the Crows?
Oh.
That person was never identified. So is it more than one person or what?
I think in the book, Professor Cohen was on friendly terms with a lady named Madame Simone. And it's mentioned at the end of the book that Madame Simone, her son got a new apartment, and that apartment that he got belonged to Professor Cohen. So unfortunately, Madame Simone was the one who wrote letters about everyone at the library, but especially about Professor Cohen to get that apartment.
Okay.
But you're not the only one that asks that. That's actually a question on the internet about the book. Someone asks, you know how sometimes you can, questions about me like, where did Janet Skeslien Charles grow up? Where did she go to school? Is she married? And who wrote the Crow letters? So that's actually a common, I must not have made that very clear because you're not the only one who asked that question.
Thank you.
In our group, we wondered about the character in Chicago, Odile's friend, that none of us could really remember reading anything about her.
You know something? This is what's wrong with editing a book. As I said, the book was called The War Bride, and so there was about 40 pages about Odile's life in Montana and how she got here. And so war brides, I learned in researching the book, ended up in Red Cross camps in Normandy. The camps were named after cigarette companies. So you had Camp Lucky Strike, Camp Marlboro. And so they went to these camps to kind of learn English or learn how to be an American wife before they got their papers, their visas. And after the war, the U.S. government's priority was getting the soldiers home, especially the injured soldiers. And then when there was space on ships, they sent the war brides over. So there was quite a bit of time for the women in these Red Cross / cigarette camps. And so that's where I think at the beginning of the book, there's a mention that Lily snoops in Mrs. Gustafson's mailbox and she sees letters from as far away as Chicago. And so that's the first really hint of the friend that we see. And so in those 40 pages that I cut, we see the passage, the ocean passage to New York, and then Odile and a group of women get on the train and they go towards Chicago, and one by one they get off the train, and then she's left in Chicago with her friend. And then of course Odile takes the Empire Builder alone on the train. And I was really sad to cut those pages. I did a lot of writing in this book at a convent. Paris, I think Paris has a really great reputation. There's Hemingway, there's Fitzgerald, but I don't know how they got anything done. Paris is such a lively, busy place that there's a lot of distraction. And so I was writing a lot of this book at the convent, and it was called The War Bride. And I just have a just like a flash of inspiration where I realized that couldn't be the book. The book had to be the Paris Library. And so I had to take out those 40 pages. And so that's why we don't know that much about the friend she's barely mentioned, because even before I started looking for an agent, I cut those pages. Another thing that I cut in those 40 pages was the fact that Odile and Buck had met previously. When Odile was banished from the American Library to the American Hospital, she was looking out for soldiers, and she was holding the hand of one soldier waiting in the corridor. And he said they got to talking a little bit, and he said, "I love you." And she said, "With all the medication they put in you, you love a goat," and that made him laugh. And that was Buck. That was Buck. And so when he saw her again, he recognized her. But that first time he saw her, she was very happy and upbeat. And the next time he saw her, she was devastated. And he knew that she knew how he felt, because he'd gone from being an innocent young man to having seen war, and he was devastated himself. And so I was sad to cut a lot of those things. I was sad to cut the Montana scenes, but it had to be done. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, that's perfect. I wish I could read those.
Short story.
Go ahead.
What were your primary research sources and non-primary?
What were my primary resources?
Research sources.
Oh, well, a lot of this book I researched in the National Library, which is across the river from where I live. And so they have pristine copies of the Paris edition of the New York Herald. So I read about a year of newspapers looking at the girdle ads, the cigarette ads, the articles, the worry of war juxtaposed with what plays were on that week. I read a lot of memoirs written by women. There was, for example, the madam of a house of prostitution gave her thoughts on the war and the Nazi clientele and the political situation. There was an American wife of a Frenchman who got called up to serve in the military, and she basically just followed him around. Anytime he went to a base, she found a hotel near the base and followed him around. So there were journalists that I read their memoirs. And these things were published right away, so it was really kind of hot off the press, where time hadn't diluted anything. And I think that's important, because as time goes on, we see things in different ways. As I said, I contacted the descendants, so I cold called Boris's kids, Helen Bickweiler and Peter Ustanoff's daughter and granddaughter. I called them, wrote the emails, got documents. I wrote to I wrote to a lot of libraries to get information. For example, right after the war, there was a librarian from Idaho named Ruth McBurney, and I was hoping her files would have letters from Boris, because I knew they'd worked together, and I thought maybe they had corresponded. So it was, I wrote to the State Library in Berlin asking for information. So these are some of the things I did. Library journal. I read a couple of years of library journal to find out what library patrons were like at the time, what librarians' worries or concerns were, things like this. I read Anthony Beevor's World War II just to have the timeline. There was a book called The Missile Next Door about the Cold War. I read another book about the Cold War. I lived it, but like a lot of us have. So these are some of the things that I looked at.
You studied with when you were at the University of Montana?
I took a class with Lucy Greeley. I took a class with William Kittredge, and there was a guy named David Cates I really thought was a wonderful, wonderful professor. I still have his syllabus. And I think of everybody, I think I got the most out of his class. He was really a wonderful instructor. He taught the sandwich method of criticism, where you say something nice, you say what you have to say, and then you follow it up with something positive. And so as a teacher myself, someone who's taught for over 20 years, I use that all the time. And French people are very critical. Like one time, I think not critical in the way of negative necessarily, but just they're taught to really say what they think. And I was teaching at an engineering school, and the top grade is 20. I was told by my supervisors if I had a class average higher than 16, I would have to explain myself. I could not give perfect grades, because then the kids would, be full of themselves or get big heads or think they wouldn't have to work. And that happens quite a lot, where it's hard, so people are very critical. And so with David Cate's method of teaching, I actually had to teach the students how they would give presentations, and I would have them write 3 positive things and then 2 things that their classmates could work on, so that they would learn how to kind of give that same kind of positive and helpful feedback that David Cate gave to me.
I have 3 more questions. And 2 of them are kind of personal, but in the first one is that original library still standing? Is it still there, that building, one that's in your book?
The original library was the one in the photos that I showed you is the second. It's the second location of the library, and that one was destroyed. It's now a big glass modern building. It's the only building on that street that was destroyed, and it was destroyed just to make office space. And it's now Dannon headquarters. But weirdly, I talked to a librarian in the north of France from a town named Lille, and she worked for Dannon in that building. And she saw my book, which she read because she worked at that same exact address. And she told me that they kept the garden area. So that photo you saw of the garden still exists, but the building is gone.
Probably haven't been asked this before. I have a past connection with Conrad, some people in Conrad, and I was wondering as I started the book, maybe you might have known this family, and their last name was Gustafson, and I was surprised when that was the name that you used, which when she was married, Buck Gustafson. So I was just curious if he was a veterinarian in Conrad.
No, I don't know him, but there are a lot of sons, in Shelmont. So I just chose a son at random, and I liked the name Gustafson. And I think it was Grumpy Old Men. I think the movie Grumpy Old Men, I'm pretty sure there's a Gustafson in there. And I just, that movie we watch it every summer. Because it's the cold in Minnesota, and when you're having a heat wave in Shelby, Montana, and it's 104 degrees, it's really fun to watch those moments. So no, I didn't know anybody. I didn't know anybody named Gustafson. It's just walking the cemetery, you see a lot of sons.
My last question is, I'm actually going to be in Paris in July. Are you going to be there?
I will be in Paris in July.
I'd love to meet up with you or visit your library, or so. Is your email address on your website?
It is. Okay. It is.
Is the Polish library on Ile de Louis?
Yes. Exactly. Yes.
I love that. It's just a tiny little island in the stream, and I thought it was mostly chocolate factories and coffee shops.
Yes, no, the library is still there. Yes, it's beautiful. And I think since the pandemic, pandemic, I think that island kind of, it started to get tourist shops, but then there were no tourists. So those tourist shops closed. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of those shops. It'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Anything else?
One more
One
over
more.
here.
Fine.
The book, I think maybe the back cover says you split your time between France and Montana. When you're in Montana, are you in your hometown, Shelby, or elsewhere?
I'm in Shelby. I usually spend a month in the summer. As I said, I've always been a teacher, so that usually permits me to spend a month with my parents in Shelby. My sister lived in Billings for many years, so I was usually spent a weekend in Billings as well. Now she's in Roundup. But my nieces went to the Billings Library, and so I've been to the Billings Library and loved it. I haven't been to the new building, but it looks beautiful. It looks absolutely beautiful.
You said your sister lives in Roundup?
Yes.
My daughter lives in Roundup, so what's your sister's name?
Her name is Kathy Skeslien.
Oh, the same as your name.
She teaches in Billings. She teaches in Billings.
My daughter teaches special ed at the high school in Roundup.
Oh, my sister teaches special ed in Billings, but for little like preschool, so the opposite end of the age group.
Thank you so much. This was really very, very interesting.
Oh, well, thank you so much for choosing the book. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I'm just really delighted that we could have this conversation. It made my day to get your invitation, so thank you
No, I
very
mean,
much.
I've been doing this for 10 years, running this program. And the highlight of every single one is talking to the authors. And in 10 years, I've had exactly one person turn me down. Just didn't have the time to do it. We were talking about him at lunch. But it's been fascinating, and you're up there on the list. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
What time is it there?
What time is it?
9 p.m.
It's 9:45.
9:45.
It's 9:45. Yes, I had to fix the lighting because I knew it would get dark. And when I started, I didn't need the light, but I turned them on anyway because I knew it would get dark here. Yes. Yes. Well, thank you so much. My next book also takes place in France, and it's also an American librarian, but this time it'll be World War I. And it's a true story of an American librarian who revolutionized the French library system. So I think it'll be a fun story to tell. I hope it won't take me 10 years.
The book is right behind you on your bookshelf, and I can see right there.
I don't know because there's a lot of books.
No, it's got a person on the front. That one. Yep.
This is the French edition of my book, and it's called A Thirst for Books and for Liberty, which I thought was kind of a strange title. But then the pandemic hit, and we were in confinement and lockdown, and we did have a thirst for liberty and books because the bookstores were closed, and we could only go within like a half-a-mile radius of our house. So I think that the publisher was, I think she was absolutely right about that title. And the thing about Paris is in France, Paris does not sell. When people outside of Paris think about Paris, they think about traffic and air pollution. So, it's just kind of like New York where we say, oh, nice place to visit, but we wouldn't want to live there. It's kind of that same kind of mentality towards Paris. So I think like the world, a lot of people dream about going to Paris one day, but a lot of French people do not dream about going to Paris one day. They just view it as maybe an obstacle course, with a lot of people, a lot of traffic, maybe people kind of not as friendly as other places in France. So, so it couldn't be called the Paris Library, and that's why she chose a different name.
Thank you again. Very much.
Thank you.
Well, enjoy